welcome to today's episode. This is one of the many content pieces that we at ActiveProspect have been putting together and will continue in the weeks and months ahead as we help the lead generation and performance marketing industry navigate the most recent FCC one-to-one consent rules and the related updates to TCPA, our Telephone Consumer Protection Act. We believe the content we're putting together will help you decode these changes with more confidence and a focus on compliance. Today's topic: don't play the waiting game. Here's some strategies for anticipating TCPA updates. First, some housekeeping information. Our webinar platform is a chat icon and a questions icon. We encourage you to ask questions, and we have someone monitoring them throughout the presentation. Please use the chat session for general comments and interactions with the participants, and please use the question section if there's items that you'd like to pose to us today. We'll leave time at the end to review and respond to questions, but we'll also do our best to keep an eye out and provide responses throughout today's program. We have a brief 2-minute survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of today's session, and we'll also have a poll during today's session. That'll be the poll icon on the right section as well. The live recording will be emailed out tomorrow morning for you to share with your colleagues. Hello, I'm Benjamin Farrar. I am the Director of Privacy, Security, and Compliance at ActiveProspect. For the past 20 years, I've worked in companies in the performance marketing and market research space, including Dentsu and WPP Cantor, as well as Ernst & Young in New York and Ochsner Clinic Hospital in New Orleans, Louisiana, with much focus on data privacy, data regulation, compliance, internal auditing, and information security throughout my career. And now for a brief background and introduction, I'd like to pass the mic to my co-host today, Michael Peronto.
Oh, great. Thanks, Ben. So again, my name is Michael Peronto. I'm the Director of Professional Services here at ActiveProspect. I have over 13 years of performance marketing, CRM, and contact center experience. Some of my past work experience, I've worked for Cardinal Financial Company, Limited Partnership, Fairway Independent Mortgage Corporation, as well as Velocify Inc. and Shape Software. In the interest of time, I'm just going to go ahead and pass it on to Alysa. Alysa, go right ahead.
Thank you. I'm Alysa Hutnik. I chair Kelly Dry's privacy practice group and our TCPA practice. And I've had, would you say, like the luck, I don't know, the short straw of really living the TCPA TSR adventure ride for the last 20 years. So happy to bring that experience and have a good discussion today. And I will pass it to my colleague.
Hi, everyone. I ended up joining Alysa in her office due to some technical issues on my end. But my name is Jenny Wainwright. I am a senior associate here at Kelly Dry. My practice actually spans 2 practice groups here. I work a lot with the communications folks on our end that focus on all things FCC. But in addition to that, I have the great pleasure of working very closely with Alysa, specifically on TCPA, telemarketing compliance issues. So I get to kind of see both vantage points of it, which makes for a really interesting day most days.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, we were really happy to have you all today, and Kelly Dry reputation, and both of you, your experiences and backgrounds are amazing. So really happy to dig into the conversation today. Jenny, I'd like to start with you, particularly for your background and working in the FTC and you following all of the developments very closely. I'd like to know about, give us, as we start out, some of the recent trends you've been seeing in this space regarding the FCC one-to-one consent rules. A lot happened in the first 4 months of the year. We've been recapping that on our previous episodes, but what have you been seeing now as you operationalize this for advice to clients and also directly from the FCC themselves about translating some of these rules?
Sure. So that's a great question. I think the name of this session, right? Don't wait, don't play the waiting game, is incredibly important because ever since the FCC rolled out the one-to-one consent rule, it's just been a ton of questions about implementation. And it's not just strictly from an FCC perspective. And I know Alysa can talk more about this as well, but you see from an industry perspective, a need to put those one-to-one consent considerations into play right now, from the carrier perspective, from a texting platform perspective. So, the urgency is there, even though as a technical matter, right, on the FCC side, the rule does not go into effect until next January. But in addition to that, it's not just the one-to-one consent rule that has come out. There has been a slew of regulatory changes that have come out since that December order. The December order really was the first of those big changes, but then they followed that up with the AI declaratory ruling. They followed that up very shortly thereafter with the change on the revocation of consent rules. And all of those have different implementation deadlines. So in the December order, there was one piece that went into effect, another one for carriers was going into effect in July, and then the one-to-one consent in January, and then in the February order, you had a piece that went into effect in April, and then another one that's still on hold. So there are just so many different deadlines to bear in mind, and it can be very confusing because some of them are interrelated. So that I think that's the big trend, is just keeping track of all the moving pieces. So, and Alysa, I know if you want to maybe weigh in a little bit more on the carrier side and the platform side and immediate implementation of one-to-one.
Sure. Well, one, I will say, if your head is spinning with, all right, what were those dates? And I was trying to write them down. We have a number of blog posts that we'll provide as resources that just recaps all of that. So feel free to just listen to us and not take lots of notes. Jenny's point, I think, is a really good one, because while from a business side, I think you want the time to even test what is that user flow for a one-to-one consent. There's a lot of different ways one could do that. We have seen, and many on this call, I'm sure, have heard from the platforms, really from pressure from the carriers who have their own pressure from the FCC to really kind of clamp down on phishing, spamming, robocall, all the unwanted calls and texts that they are getting so many complaints about, that one-to-one consent rule is being enforced now. And so we've seen the auditors and the platforms really reach out to their customers and say, wait, I'm looking at your privacy policy, or I'm looking at your TCPA consent language on your URLs, and I noticed that it's saying and affiliates or and marketing partners with a hyperlink. And even though you think that that's not a legal requirement that you have to address until early next year, they are saying you have to address it now. And so that's just the business reality. They have the discretion to enforce a business rule sooner. And that is, in fact, what they are doing. So even if you've not heard necessarily from your platform, know that they are reaching out. And many are being have to very quickly address to the new requirements and come up with a new flow to deal with it.
Yeah, so Alysa and Jenny, I think you brought up some really interesting points there, because there are members of our audience who currently use CRM and contact centers. And with those tools, they often have to register to use text messaging and deliver text messages through those platforms. Now, some of my experience with this is actually fairly recent as well, more on the CRM and contact center side. So we have seen customers who were previously allowed to text. They had filled out a form maybe 2 or 3 years ago. They were actually fully approved at that time. And then now the carriers are going back, actually revisiting their website, looking at the privacy policies, like you said, and even looking at their business models and determining if they meet their requirements to be able to deliver text messages on their platform. Another key component to that as well is that if you are brand new and you're signing up with a CRM or contact center, they are going to provide you with a form to fill out. It's very important what you put on that form. If you're going to be talking about your business, you want to make sure that you're very clear with what that business, what your business is and what its activities are. You want to make sure that the content of your text messages meet both the regulatory guidelines as well as the carrier guidelines. Because I've seen situations where certain companies have actually had their text messages blocked by downstream carriers because they don't meet those deadlines. So there's a lot of things to think about when you're talking about the carriers and being able to deliver text messages through their platforms in regards to the gathering of consent. Some other things I'd like for you guys to provide some opinion on is artificial intelligence. So obviously we've seen a lot of things in regards to AI. There's certain service providers that provide services that utilize AI to send and receive text messages. They consume data. What are some things that our audience should be thinking about with that in regards to both the disclosures as well as consumer privacy?
Oh, so many fun things. All right, where do we begin? First of all, technology has been used. We've been using technology for quite some time in all sorts of different ways, right? And it just continues to evolve. So from a privacy standpoint, I always want to know who is using the AI and who gets to benefit from using the data. And so data inputs, how it's being processed, who it's being processed by. I would imagine there's many on this call who may have gotten hit by some of the chatbot lawsuits in the wiretapping space. And it just raised that question on when you are using partners, you need to know how they're using your data to improve their products or to monetize for other purposes. And so that's just diligence. It's contract terms. It may be disclosures that one needs to do. So one, it's just understanding how you are using whatever the AI is. Maybe it's sentient analysis in terms of the voices. Maybe it's all of that has some privacy triggers that you need to think about, both in do you use it? Are there restrictions? Are there contracts around that? Who else gets to essentially use the data? So that is one big point there. The other is just think about what are the hot button issues where, from a risk perspective, we're seeing tons of regulator scrutiny, we're seeing litigation, robocalls, and I use that term and I hate that term because lots of folks like it can mean different things, but we know that pre-recorded messages, for example, avatars, ringless voicemail, like think of all the things we've heard in the past, tend to drive extra scrutiny. So if you want to go to the top of the list in terms of what is going to generate complaints and may invite a regulator to look into your practices, some technologies that might involve AI are more likely than others. So if it's more of a data analysis, help you improve your business as opposed to interfacing with the consumer, that on your risk scale can be on the lower end of risk if it's not going to be interacting, right? Substituting or enhancing a person in terms of interaction with the consumer.
Great.
Then,
Go ahead.
I was just thinking the FCC side. I didn't cover that.
Yeah.
No. I mean, I think the only add-on that I would say to that in terms of regulator scrutiny is that the FCC has very much thrown its hat in the ring on AI issues. It's part of the Consumer Advocacy Committee that the FCC has formed. That's one of the key issues that they're looking at. And specifically on TCPA issues, some of the folks on here may have heard about this. It actually made some pretty big national news. There was a concerted effort through what they called an AI robocall deepfake was how it was characterized. But it was a calling campaign ahead of the New Hampshire primary back in January where somebody simulated President Biden's voice and told voters not to go vote in the primary. And that, again, that's kind of a nuanced example, but the FCC used that and the high profile example that it set to not only explicitly say that AI technologies like voice cloning that was used in that particular case are subject to TCPA regulation. They consider it pre-recorded voice, and therefore it's very much under the restrictions and requirements of the TCPA. But they also used it last month, right? It's June still. Last month to issue a couple of enforcement actions. I think it was a total of $8 million in proposed penalties for that instance.
And just mark my words, every presidential election, there is a red and a blue enforcement action by the FCC in terms of texting. And so just keep that in mind for texting and calling campaigns in the political sphere, following the rules.
Yeah. And one thing I've, as a compliance officer, I'm making sure I also personally, internally try to use the term generative AI because AI is a lot of things. There's uses of AI in the business that don't intersect with these considerations that we're talking about. And AI has privacy issues with ethics and discrimination, all those sorts of things. The stuff we're talking about here with those components is the generation of voice or text, mimicking a human, and then that use in the calling and texting components. So
right.
I've been making sure, because I find some of our colleagues will get lost and say, wait, what about that great solution we were considering inside the company for AI? Does the FCC say we can't do that? No, that's not exactly what that was about. So I did want to caveat that. Yeah.
Right. And I was tapped yesterday, the FTC. I know we've got a bit of alphabet soup with the agencies. The FTC put out another business guidance blog post on generative AI and just a checklist on things to think about. I posted something on LinkedIn on today as well. So extra resources for homework.
Excellent. Yeah.
So Alysa and Jenny, I had a follow-up question here. So we have, we obviously have a lot of members of our audience who they've had several questions in regards to how does the FCC's one-to-one consent requirement directly affect them? And, what we've seen many, many different models that have come into play. But one of the models that we would like to talk about on this webinar, we've gotten tons of questions and comments about this, is regards to the gathering of TCPA consent on both a live transfer or an inbound phone call. So with that, what we're going to do on this webinar is something that we actually don't typically do. We're going to talk about a particular case that came out recently, as well as have a PowerPoint going through the description. So let's just go ahead and pull up that PowerPoint here. All right. So the case is Bradley v. dentalplans.com. We're going to talk about the background and then the court's opinions. So just a little bit of background on this case. The plaintiff placed a call to Dental Plans in November of 2018, and they intended to sign up for a dental savings plan. When the plaintiff spoke to a representative from the company, the representative confirmed the plaintiff's phone number and then asked the plaintiff if she consented to Dental Plans contacting her with an automatic dialing system or pre-recorded message, along with some other disclosures. The plaintiff requested confirmation about the purpose of the automated phone calls, and the representative stated it was to keep you updated with any plan information and confirming that only Dental Plans would be calling them. The plaintiff agreed to receive the calls as described by the representative and signed up for Cigna Dental Discount Plan through dentalplans.com on that call. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. All right. So nearly a year after that phone call took place, Dental Plans called the customer back to inquire about specifics of her plan. The plaintiff explained that she did not want her to auto-renew, and the representative said that she would be notified when her plan expired. After her plan expired, the plaintiff received approximately 10 pre-recorded phone calls from Dental Plans. These calls were referred to by Dental Plans as win-back calls. So when she received those calls, the plaintiff filed suit in the United States District Court for the District of Maryland under the TCPA against dentalplans.com, as well as Cigna Health and Life Insurance Company. In the case, there was significant arguments about whether the TCPA disclosures that were read to the plaintiff on the initial phone call met the standard under TCPA for prior expressed written consent. So let's go through some of the court's opinions. Let's start off with the first one. So the court's opinion found that at a minimum, the calls made after the plan expired, also known as the win-back calls in the case, constituted telemarketing phone calls. This then brought up the question in the case of whether the initial disclosures that were read to the plaintiff during the first phone call met the standard under the TCPA for prior expressed written consent. Let's go on to the next part of the court opinion here. So the court's findings. The court finds that an audio capture / recording alone is not sufficient to obtain prior expressed written consent for the purposes of the ATDS / pre-recorded provision of the TCPA. The court's reasoning was that the application of the TCPA required that specific disclosures be made to satisfy prior express written consent, and the consumer disclosure section of the e-Sign Act applies, and that requires that the disclosures outlined be provided in writing. Just a little bit more down here, and then we'll move right on to Alysa, your and Jenny's thoughts on this. So in regards to the e-Sign Act, it requires certain conditions to be satisfied when a statute, a regulation, or other rule of law that requires the information related to a transaction or transactions in or affecting interstate or foreign commerce be provided or made available to a consumer in writing. And the court stated in a footnote here, the signature and consent the consumer provides can still be provided via voice recording, as can the substance of the agreement. The only portion of the agreement that would not be able to be provided via voice recording under this outcome would be the TCPA's required disclosures. All right, that was a lot of reading. So Alysa and Jenny, go ahead and unpack that for the audience.
Well, first, why is this a big deal? This was a very recent decision, and it comes at a time where many of those on the call are trying to think about how do you transition to this one-to-one consent requirement, with some options being you get the one consent via the web flow. You have them on the phone, or it's an inbound call. And as you're trying to find who's the right, let's say you're matching to an insurance partner, you're trying to find who the right one is. And it's on that call when you're having the discussion that's where you would get the one-to-one consent for the matched partner that you're going to provide. Okay. So this really jeopardizes that concept. It's one decision. But if we might, I'm going to get to kind of how do we think about this go forward, but why did this even lawsuit happen in the first place, and just some practical things to think about. Number one, the call happened almost a year after the original outbound. And I think from a consumer protection standpoint, when somebody is not expecting a call, they don't know who you are necessarily, they are more likely to complain. They just are. So think about in terms of the aging of your lists. That's one mitigation factor, and coming up with a reasonable sunset period for when you have had no activity related to that phone number. You may choose not to call aging numbers. Number two, they use pre-recorded messages. And as we mentioned earlier, that just is going to go to the top of the list on a source of consumer complaints. Had they not used, for example, pre-recorded messages or not called that many times with those kinds of calls, this may never have turned into an escalated complaint that turned into litigation. So just thinking through some of those factors, knowing what is telemarketing, if they were, and maybe it's just the legal argument they made in this case, but without having a pretty rigorous process to put in one bucket, what are your truly informational calls versus the telemarketing, and the telemarketing ones where you are going to go through and scrub against your internal do not call list, like that's important. People, the definition of what is telemarketing and advertising is very broad, and it's really important given how highly regulated we are in this space to have a very tight process around classifying and dealing with them as telemarketing. So that's kind of the background on a lot of those mitigation measures. Now, what do we do with this decision? Well, number one, you can still do all of that on the phone. This is prior express written consent, and you have the question on whether you're using an auto dialer. You might make the decision, given where we are with the Supreme Court's decision, it's not an auto dialer. So maybe you land there. Maybe you land, we do this on the phone, but the issue here is consumer expectations with being able to have that written disclosure. And so thinking about, is there a companion place where you might provide the disclosure in real time or prior to the call? Maybe it's you get their consent to send them a text or an email that has the disclosure. And I just think about from a privacy standpoint and consumer preferences, they're hearing this really fast on the phone. You want to be able to say they can go back and revisit those disclosures. They can see it. They have it memorialized so that if they want to revisit that choice, they know what the terms of it are and how to do so. So there may be a supplemental way that you package that up so you continue current practices without too much variation. I think we'll hear some other options down, but in terms of some immediate ways to just think about what do we do next? If there's a big theme, though, we're just moving in one direction. Everything is getting a little bit tighter, a little bit more rigorous, a little bit more making sure we are catering to each individual consumer and their expectations. And so I would just say this is why you have a pretty thoughtful, comprehensive compliance program in the first instance.
I think that's a pretty comprehensive overview of the specific case at issue here. But I would wholeheartedly agree with the statement about what I've been saying generally since the FCC regulatory changes have come out is consents being squeezed at both ends, right? It's harder to get. They're narrowing the scope of what constitutes consent with the one-to-one consent rule, and then on the back end with the changes to the revocation of consent rules, they're making it easier for consumers to opt out, and so it's important to just kind of think of that as a framework for putting together a compliance program and keeping consumer expectations in mind.
Yeah, and I think you bring up some good points there. And, Alysa, you brought up some good operational points where, if you're thinking about like a live transfer generator selling a lead to a live transfer buyer, right? So that live transfer generator may receive a lead, whether it's an inbound phone call or the customer goes to a form that's for that live transfer generator. They would call that consumer, ask them some pre-screening questions, which is standard in the industry. And then from there, you need, in the future state for the FCC, you need to gather consent, right? And I think to operationalize it, you would need to show that consumer in some way what those disclosures are that they're saying. To your point, you could sit there and have a recording that plays the disclosure to them. They're probably not going to understand it or retain that information. Whether it's something where you get permission to send them a quick text or email that brings them to a page that has those disclosures so they can see them. And then once they go through and agree to those disclosures, we recommend they just submit it through a form. If you're going to bring them to a page, have them submit a form that has those disclosures in the company they're transferring them to. That's probably a more preferable format and will help them to stay in compliance. In addition to that, there's some other things that you guys mentioned that I think are appropriate for us to dissect on this call. And there's even some questions from the audience on this. If you are capturing consent, you've obviously worked probably with numerous call centers and things like that. What are some mitigation tactics from the call center's perspective, from, whether it's training or scripting, that they can do to help make sure that they are reading these disclosures correctly and that they are also interpreting the customer's consent correctly?
I can't tell you how many call center audits I've done. Just, the real world experience of training, quality assurance, audits, monitoring, right? These are folks, sometimes they're young, there's a lot of turnover. And how do you make sure, is it what are you having these call reps do? How varied is it? Do you have dedicated reps who are working from the same set of scripts? So just think about, put yourself in the shoes of that call rep themselves and think about what set them up for success, and then make sure that you've got a good enough feedback loop to know whether your intended program is working the way you think it should work. And we see that the diligence factor just getting amped up also by partners, where they want proof of the quality assurance. They want to see that you are doing those things. So I think that accountability, we're only going to see more expectations of that. And I think where you can make a good showing on it, you can use that for business positive purposes, right? You are a more trustworthy partner. You provide higher value matches as a result because of the caliber of your team members.
Yeah, and I think to that point, we talked a little bit about this even on our previous webinar, where, if you are running a call center that's fielding inbound calls or placing outbound calls, you need to be regularly auditing what your call center is doing, right? This isn't something where it's like, well, I trained them once and I hope that they comply with it. That's a recipe for non-compliance, as well as, it can affect your sales. There's a litany of things with that. One thing that we called out that was important is scripting. Have a script displaying on that agent screen that shows what that disclosure is. So that way, if they're going to be going to a point of reading a disclosure, sending that disclosure to the customer, they both see it, they both understand it, and then you can gather that consent. Some other things about it as well is that if you're dealing with third-party vendors, you need to have, from a contractual perspective, the ability to audit their calls, right? Because some instances some contracts don't allow for that, or you don't think that you need to audit it. In addition to that, you need to be able to have storage of the consent for those phone calls. So if you have a third-party partner who's gathering consent for you, they need to transfer that consent over to you for your record-keeping requirements and any phone calls that are made, et cetera. So there's a lot of things that you pointed out that I think are very important from a business perspective.
Michael, just on that point, it matters what you are doing too, like what you are auditing for. Because I think most call centers, and you have audits occurring, like there's a fairly regular business expectation that that's going to occur. But I think we found that when we actually look for what is being audited, it's very business centric, as opposed to thinking about, are we also looking for some of these very new developments, that really could threaten the validity of the consent that we are capturing. So given how turbulent this area of the law has been, I think having a routine cadence of where you just look at all of these checks that we have in the system, look at what is the audit process, look at what is the retention, look at what is the training, so that you can just see and refresh appropriately to account for some of the changes that we've had. And there's always some business challenges that come up. I know some partners, call centers, they're not going to just hand over willy-nilly the storage of all the consents. It's got to be upon request in certain scenarios. And so just think through that in a real practical sense of when you would need those, and then how can you still have the confidence in the way you're doing the auditing to make sure that they are being done right.
Yeah, and as the auditor in me, it's an opportunity. I mean, don't view it as being adversarial. View it as you're developing a stronger relationship, right? There might be things that they don't realize that they're not performing, and it's to help balance both sides. Not like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm actually going to have to send an email and ask them about, can I see more about your background procedures?
Yeah.
So we can build a stronger relationship together and not stub our toe in the dark when there's something that we didn't realize that the other party wasn't doing.
That's exactly right, Ben, because I've personally gone through and audited phone calls for my call center that dealt with sales through telemarketing means. And often when you review the phone calls that are done by these third-party call centers, there's tips and suggestions that you can make, like, hey, you know, we gave you this initial script. Now that I'm hearing it in practice, I'm like, okay, I need to make some of these adjustments because it helps me from a sales perspective. So I think that's an excellent point, Ben, because I've seen that directly in the field. I'm sure, Alysa, you've seen that as well in the space. So what we want to do here, this is a little bit unorthodox. We're going to actually just ask a couple questions, Alysa and Jenny, for you, and then we're going to move right into our poll. So first off, we had a question from the crowd. Can prior express written consent be obtained over the phone if we mail the disclosure after the phone call?
So this is a new decision. We'll see kind of how it gets challenged and what is idiosyncratic about where this lands. But what I would say from a consumer protection standpoint, disclosures are effective when they're provided proximate to, before, that you are relying on a consent you want to enforce. And so I think going with the spirit of that, think about what you can do simultaneously. Can you get them to see a URL and then it's just memorialized on the call that they saw that URL, you've got a business record of what that page would have shown, or if they're not in front of a computer, they're okay with a text, you can send them a text. I think we can be creative in how we do that. Maybe you do memorialize after the fact by sending them a letter, but I wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket as meeting the written requirement because it comes way after if we're mailing it.
Great. Okay, so we've got another question here for you. Either one of you can answer this. What if you are not using an ATDS system, but are using a text service? Does the one-to-one consent rule apply?
Ooh, that's a good question. So the one-to-one consent rule applies to TCPA. Yes. So again, I think it's a matter of the letter of the rule, and then there's practical considerations. So again, going back to what Alysa said before, the platforms themselves are often going to have their own business requirements because of the pressure from the carriers. And this goes back to the FCC's regulation of carriers and their very clear message that carriers are to block what is perceived to be unlawful traffic. And so that filters through the whole system. And so again, there's a question of, as a strict legal matter, right? And again, we're not here to give legal advice, but then there's also, again, the practicality of the platforms themselves are going to have their own requirements. And as we've seen, many of them are enforcing a one-to-one consent requirement.
That's right. And something else here that I'd like to talk about in regards to this particular question, there are many different definitions to what an ATDS is. The courts have various opinions on this subject, and sometimes we've seen them applied to text messages. And so it's just important to understand that while you may not be using like a robo-dialing system or automated dialing system, sometimes automated texting systems do get flagged as well in that case circumstance. All right. So let's real quick go to our poll. So we've got our poll here for the audience. Are you using technology that captures and documents TCPA consent on your first-party landing pages? You'll see the poll icon off to the right of your screen. Just go ahead and answer that here. And then while we wait for the answers to those polls, we've got some questions here for Jenny in regards to universal opt-outs.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ben.
So Jenny, interested to know with the opt-out changes that are coming soon, the revoking, is this going to differ from industry to industry, or how are you advising clients to prepare for this?
The way that I generally think about it is you have to be prepared to interpret a request to opt out broadly. That is the position that the FCC has taken in terms of again, if you get a request via text message, it should apply to calls and vice versa. And again, giving consumers as much leeway as possible to opt out. Now, again, it's going to depend a little bit on the context here, right? What is the purpose of the consent to begin with? Is it for marketing calls? Is it for informational calls? What is the scope and all of that? But again, it's if you have someone who is opted in to multiple programs and then you get a request to opt out, the starting point is to interpret it broadly. Now, the FCC has also said, and they're very clear about the, particularly for text messages, right? A confirmatory message to clarify the scope, right? Somebody's texting stop and okay, you've been opted out. Do you want to continue to receive, informational messages or, something like that, right? So you absolutely have the leeway to clarify as long as you stay within the lane of the FCC's requirements, like sending the confirmation text within 5 minutes. It's the only text you send. There's no marketing information, and there's a whole litany of requirements that go into that. But again, I think in general, the message that I would have is start from a perspective of start broad, and then if you can narrow it, you can think about how to do that.
Yeah, and obviously the theme, don't play the waiting game to get ready for that. Now, is there any recent information about the date in which that goes active? I know that was published and then it was, I forget the term exactly, but indefinitely delayed. And what I was wondering, I know that doesn't mean it's gone forever. It will come back, but I was wondering if you can provide some clarification of when it does come back, does that fit into a 30-day window period or 60-day in which they want to implement it, or just what you're hearing with that date specifically? As compliance officers, we want to write this date on the calendar and work towards
I have gotten multiple requests for, have they published it yet? Have they put what's the date? I get that question probably every couple of weeks. Do we have an update? And so I think I want to parse it out just a little bit because there have been a few things that have happened, right? In terms of the revocation of consent, where again, it's the consumer can opt out by any reasonable means, and specifically things like texting stop, unsubscribe, opt out are on the FCC's list of what they consider to be per se reasonable means to revoke consent. So that specific rule, and that also encompasses the requirement to process within 10 business days. That specific rule is on hold because it's subject to a Paperwork Reduction Act, review by the Office of Management and Budget. And that just means that anytime a federal regulation comes out that potentially increases a paperwork burden on businesses, the federal government is required to undertake a review of that. So once the rule was published in the Federal Register, or once the order was published in the Federal Register, normally that would trigger the clock for the effective date. But because of the PRA review, it is on hold indefinitely until that review is completed. And then the FCC said in the February order that it would be 6 months after the PRA review is complete that the rule would become effective. So what I'm watching for at this point is a publication in the Federal Register by the FCC saying that the PRA review is complete, and that will announce the effective date. So that's what I'm continually keeping an eye out for. I just checked it 2 days ago. As of, I think, Monday, there was not a publication. The last publication was, again, the original order back in March. So we're still waiting is the answer, unfortunately.
That's great. Yeah, and I encourage everyone to circle that date on the 6 months out, and then keep adjusting that, because now is the time to start implementing and experimenting with solutions for what is reasonable means, because there's going to be some judgment about that component and coming up with a program to perform that. Excellent.
Yeah. And Ben, I think to your point on that, when this entire webinar, when we're talking about don't play the waiting game, this also includes getting your systems in sync, right? So if we have situations where you have many, many different vendors that you're working with, or many different programs that you work with, you need to make sure that those programs talk to each other now. So if you get an opt-out through a text message, that it tells your CRM system like, hey, this person opted out, right? If you have a call center that's calling on your behalf, or you're using a calling technology, if you receive an opt-out, somebody opts out over the phone verbally, you need to be training your agents to properly mark that person has been opted out through these appropriate channels. One of the worst things that can happen is a consumer tells you, hey, don't call me anymore, or don't text me anymore. And then 10, 15 days later, your call center that may not have that information starts calling them, right? You can start getting complaints and things like that. So you want to make sure that if you have a lot of systems that you're working with, that those systems start talking with each other, or you start having discussions with those vendors about how you can get them to talk to each other.
I want to just put a practical point, because we are talking about where the letter of the law is. Yeah. I would also just take a look at how many call attempts and how many disposition calls you are doing, because sometimes what we find is people don't know to say the magic word, stop calling me. They just don't want to talk to you, and so they keep hanging up on you, or they don't pick up the phone. But if you are calling the same number 50 times in 1 week, maybe, and they are not calling you back, or they are hanging up as soon as your agent says something, maybe you might want to disposition that call a different way. Not necessarily say it's a do not call, but just think about how you roll out a number off of your campaigns as another just practical mitigation measure.
Yeah. And I think to your point, Alysa, with that, the other part that I think is important is like how training your agents how to disposition correctly.
Oh, yeah.
I see this all the time with call centers where a customer will say, hey, take me off your list, and they mark it as not interested,
or wrong number, or something.
Or wrong number, or something that's just complete, or sometimes they don't mark it at all, which is the worst outcome that you could have. But, you know, when you're going through your training, you know, for your call centers, you want to make sure that if they are making dispositions and those dispositions are tied directly to your compliance practices, that they understand what each one of them means. And you even do like some role playing with them to make sure they do the correct disposition.
Right. And sometimes you can check just by whatever is the first drop down. If you are saying 90% of like certain agents are always picking the first drop down, maybe that's a clue that it's a good time to refresh training.
Yeah, it's a funny story. It's just great that you brought that up, because I actually have experienced that myself. So I've had people that I've consulted experience that same exact thing. So it's interesting when you look at the positioning of dispositions within a contact center platform or a CRM, you will find that first disposition that's there is chosen typically at a higher percent than any of the other dispositions listed. So some things that I've done is I've actually categorized my dispositions into like sections, where it's like ones where it's like customer not interested, or DNC is like its own section on its own, so they can scroll down to that section and find it. But yeah, I've definitely experienced that. And something else to take note is that your dispositions are used for your marketing too, marketing and sales. So if you've got reps that are marking things incorrectly, your whole downstream reporting is affected by that as well. It can affect your contact rate, your opt-out rates, all these different things. So it's not just something that's important for compliance, but it's also important for sales and marketing as well. All right, so let's go and look at the answers of the poll. Wow, so this one is actually a little bit surprising to me. So we've got about 26% that are currently not using technology to capture consent on their first-party landing pages. We have 23% that are currently in the process of implementing this on their landing pages, and we've got 50% that already have a solution to capture and document consent on their landing pages. So this one is actually a little surprising to me, because we see a lot of companies that have they're either in the process of doing it or they've already done it. But if you do not have a solution where when a customer is visiting your landing page, you're appropriately capturing the event of them submitting their information with the appropriate disclosures, that's something that you're definitely going to want to do with the upcoming changes, and even with current changes as well. Because if you receive a TCPA complaint from one of these known litigators that are out there, you're going to want to have documentation of this consent. Otherwise, your case becomes a lot harder. So let's move on to some more questions here from the crowd. All right, so we have a question here. Can you send the customer a text legally to obtain prior express written consent? Is the first text considered informational?
So you need, it depends on what you put in that.
Okay.
And I can say that we've seen some cases go a little awry, but for the most part, if you have a basis of consent for the first text, not the prior express written consent, but they filled out the application, they gave you their number as a point of contact, or they checked a box saying informational communications are fine, then yes, usually that is acceptable if you don't stick in any offers in that messaging to send that out and get the response back. And sometimes, because you can have a consistent record if you do it that way, that can be a good way to refresh consent on an annual or whatnot basis. So that way you're not relying on a 6-year-old consent, and maybe that number has since been disconnected and reassigned to a new person.
Great. We have another question here. This one pertains to a little bit to inbound calls. So the question here is, what constitutes an existing business relationship when calling back consumers you have previously spoke to?
You have the burden of proof. So just like when you get investigated by state regulator, the Federal Trade Commission, or the FCC, or you're in litigation with a private plaintiff, you have to prove that you have a legitimate EBR. And so if you're relying on an inquiry-based EBR and it's an inbound call, you have to demonstrate, think of it en masse, not just one particular call. Think about it for campaigns over months or years.
Right.
You have to show that they actually were interested in XYZ product that was the subject of the campaign. I don't know, maybe you make calls on behalf of or in relation to separate different lines. So just think about, I always feel like you pressure test if I think about what would you rely on. And if it's just they left a voicemail after hours and you don't actually know, or you see their caller ID, but you don't know why they were calling, that's not going to be enough. It's pretty thin basis to be able to say that you have an EBR. And so if they filled out an application, that's easier, right? If they called and you actually had an in-depth conversation and you have care notes that document that, and they weren't ready to close the deal, but they were interested, that is pretty good evidence. So I would just think about it at scale. Can you consistently have a record that you could point to that would make the case?
And from a time period, if I'm not mistaken, the TSR does include some dates or time period about our existing business relationships. If someone's not familiar with that, I wanted to make them aware of that.
Yeah, no, and I was just going to actually chime in with just that point, which is that, of course, when you're talking about an EBR, there's the federal standard, and then there's the state standards, and those do not always align. Sometimes they do, but there are many instances where, from a state telemarketing perspective, the EBR timeline is different. And defined slightly differently than it is at the federal level. So it's unfortunately not always a one-size-fits-all solution. It's
defined more conservatively.
Correct.
So instead of 3 months at the federal level, sometimes it's 1 month. Sometimes it's not at all. So just making sure you're doing it in accordance with all the layers of laws that apply.
Okay.
All right, let's look here for some of these other questions that are on here. Let's see. Okay, so Jenny, I think this one's appropriate for you, but Alysa, you can definitely answer this. For revocation, if we have opt-in consent from a form or a website, but then they DNC with the FTC or FCC website, can we still call them?
So those are two different things. There you're talking about the national do not call registry versus your internal. So the national do not call registry generally only applies if you don't have consent. So if you have a specific,
or an EBR,
correct, or an EBR, or if you have a specific consent that you're relying on, then you don't have to scrub that number against the national do not call registry.
But it doesn't mean that if they've not made an internal do not call request to you, they haven't opted out of receiving calls from you. And if you still have to have a legitimate basis to call them. So if you have a valid EBR and you're calling within the lines of the EBR, prior express written consent, you wouldn't be scrubbing against the National Do Not Call Registry because that call is exempt. You would just need to scrub against your internal Do Not Call list in case the consent was revoked before you're going to do that outbound campaign.
And Michael, you touched on this. That's why it's super important to have your systems talking to each other with the changes, right? Because a do not text request should also translate to do not call.
Okay, let's see here. Some of these questions are good.
Can I just say I really appreciate the comment about the carrier pigeon? using a carrier pigeon to get consent.
I'm glad we can still laugh about this.
Yeah.
All right, let's see here. Let's see. There was another one on here.
There's one about texting. Does each text have to have language of opt out or stop or yes, no. Yeah.
We get that question a lot.
Good question.
Right. So this is not a legal issue. This goes more to the CTIA, kind of the carrier best practices. And if it's a recurring campaign, no, it doesn't need to be in each message. You kind of think about what is the cadence of your campaign. Maybe it's every other week. Maybe, if it's a message a week, like you come up with some cadence where it's included. I think in the past, particularly when the new ruling about revocation of consent needs to be reasonable came out, as lawyers, we wanted you to have it so we could point out that if they revoked by saying on the text, I want to be opted out, like something very long that was not going to be recognized, that wasn't a reasonable way, that the stop, the cancel instruction was the reasonable way to do that. But I think we've all learned, and every other periodic inclusion is fine.
Yeah, and I've experienced a little bit of that myself. So no matter what, if it's your first text that you're sending this customer, I almost always recommend that you put that language in there. In addition to that, for some members of our crowd, especially ones that are in financial services and mortgages, there are sometimes license requirements where you have to display a loan officer's license number in there. So just be cognizant of that as well when you're sending text messages. There are other things besides having specific opt-out language that may be required for you. All right. Let's see here.
We covered one. What's the effective date for the new consent revocation rules?
Yep.
Stay tuned to Ginny's updates as they look for when those get published. And then it will be 6 months from that date.
Yeah, we do publish blogs regularly on these kinds of updates, and that's definitely one where when we have that date, it's going to go up there.
Yeah, and I encourage everyone to subscribe to the content. Kelly, Dry, you all do a really great job of the content in ad tech and MarTech and all this space, and with the latest updates on that. So definitely encourage everyone to subscribe for more updates.
Yeah, well, just a point on compliance. We're focusing a lot on the TCPA, but the FTC's telemarketing sales rule, they amended the obligations, more affirmative obligations for record keeping. So you don't want to violate the TSR by not knowing you had to retain certain records. So we cover that in our blog too, but that's a good one to just go over, make sure you're all squared away.
Yeah, because I think a lot of members of our audience, they've been hearing both the FCC's rule for the one-to-one consent, but they've heard about the TSR. But it's important that with the TSR that you understand that there are very, very specific record-keeping requirements that your system may or may not have, or there's documentation that you need to receive from other vendors that you need to have on your side of the fence within your own data systems, your CRM systems, and phone contact center softwares.
Right. And I can just tell you from defending many telemarketing sales rule investigations with the FTC, those are high stakes, and you don't want to lose on the low-hanging fruit like records. And it's burdensome. It's a lot. It's 4 years or XYZ years of all your campaign-related records. So it's not a small task.
That's right. And what I tell companies to do is that if you're using a system, it's important that you have it available within your own system. But I actually offload that data into internal data warehouses, because there are situations, and I've seen this myself, where a company will move from one software to another software, and they forget to talk to the vendor about storing the records of their phone calls and text messages. So keep that in a data warehouse so you have it all available to you. You can pull it at any time versus leaning on certain vendors to maintain that data for you. You want to make sure.
I couldn't underscore that point enough, because systems get corrupted. That vendor relationship sours, and now you have to pay them a ton of money to even contemplate giving you those records. There's just a lot of things you don't anticipate.
That's right. All right. I think we're good on the questions. Ben, you want to go ahead?
Yes. Okay. So, well, I would say I do want to mention there's one. I know we weren't going to do themes, but I do think it's important because we mentioned it a good bit, but 2 quick points. Now is the time to review, make corrections, get your terms correct. I look at this more as an opportunity, if you're trying to be optimistic, about an opportunity to reset. If there's some things you think you might not have gotten right, now is the time to go and explore that and correct those, whether it's contractually, whether it's with your language. You have the opportunity to fix it now Don't wait for the date to fix it later. Start uncovering those things now. And the other theme is think from the consumer first, right? That's a key component. Think from their perspective of what you're doing with the language of everything, the performance, the volumes of calls. If you continue to make that part of your mantra, it can put you in a good position. At ActiveProspect, you have a core value of leads are people, right? These aren't just numbers and transactions. These are phone numbers. These are text messages. And it can, deliver or be a disturbance, which is what the FCC and FTC have been stating in their language. So it's important. So those are just some, from a compliance officer perspective, the things to try to link all of these together that I wanted to share today. Okay. So I think we've got a poll right quick as we get ready to close out. First, Alysa and Jenny, want to thank you very much for the conversation today. Really great content. Really enjoyed preparing with you and digging in with some of these in-depth topics. And I encourage everyone, great legal advice. Make sure you have it aware. Make sure you have it close by. And we have two great colleagues here who are happy to take information and questions from you all. So we have a poll that we're getting ready to fire up. Be on the lookout in 2 weeks. We're going to have our next session here, webinar. So be on the lookout for that. Also want to mention a shout out to Reach to make sure that those that are looking for a membership association, that's a great one. The Responsible Enterprises Against Consumer Harassment. We'll share some links there. This is the advocacy group that's helping with others that are in and around the industry and space to try to translate these calls and advocacy back to the regulatory space. So encourage those to look for membership there. And we have our next one. We're going to share links for our next live session. Calling and texting regulations are tightening. FCC adopts one-to-one consent TCPA consent rules. So be on the lookout for that. Other than that, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you guys.